Before that, on BBC4, Richard Holloway smashes some myths about John Knox in part 2 of The Sword and the Cross.
It's the 19th of August 1561 and a delegation of Edinburgh worthies is making its way to Holyrood Palace. Inside the palace, Mary Queen of Scots is preparing to spend her first night in Scotland. Brought up at the French court, Mary, still only 19, is beautiful and highly educated, but she's also a Catholic. For John Knox, the radical voice of Scottish Protestantism, the presence of a Catholic queen is intolerable.
Spiritus Sanctus.
The psalms which he and his delegation have come to sing to Mary are not a welcome, but a warning.
Who still contrive a thing that is but vain. The kings and rulers of the earth conspire and are all bent against the Lord.
But just how accurate is this image of John Knox, the preacher who challenged a queen and tore Scotland from the grasp of medieval Catholicism? The trouble with characters like Knox is that it's now so difficult to separate the man from the myth. Was he the heroic figure of the Protestant myth who fearlessly challenged authority and single-handedly rescued Scotland from the clutches of Rome? Or was he the heretic of the Catholic myth who destroyed forever the unity of the one true church? Was he the misogynistic killjoy who pulled the plugs on pleasure, as the humanist myth portrays him? Well, the figure who emerges from behind all these myths is more complex, frail, and fascinating than we might have imagined. But getting to that real human Knox isn't going to be easy. Knox certainly didn't start out as a rebel with a cause. He was ordained as a Catholic priest in the late 1530s, precisely at the moment when the revolutionary Protestant thinking of Martin Luther was sweeping continental Europe.
Hic est enim, calix sanguinis mei.
In order to understand the enormous significance of Luther's ideas, we have to keep in mind the momentous claim that Christianity made for itself. It offered men and women the possibility of eternal bliss or eternal damnation. The only question was, how was heaven to be achieved and hell avoided? As Martin Luther agonized over whether or not he would be saved, he had an epiphany. We were not saved by our prayers or pilgrimages, by our masses or indulgences, as the church proclaimed. We were not even saved by our own good works. We were saved only by the grace of God. We were not justified by anything in our humanity, but only by our faith in the mercy of God. And by the 1540s, these ideas were convulsing Europe. Roman Catholic Scotland was to encounter Luther's Protestant ideas at first hand when a young man named Patrick Hamilton preached in St Andrews, the town where John Knox was educated. Hamilton was immediately branded a heretic by the church and executed. Hamilton's martyrdom is now commemorated every year by students in the town.
He was arrested, charged with heresy, found guilty and sentenced to death. On the last day in February 1528, he was burned at the stake on the spot now marked with his initials. He died after 6 hours of burning. Today we remember Patrick Hamilton and all martyrs with the laying of a wreath on his initials.
But if the Church believed the execution would put an end to the preaching of the Protestant heresy in Scotland, they couldn't have been more wrong. Hamilton's death sent shockwaves round Scotland, and St Andrews itself was buzzing with talk about these new ideas. It was said that the reek of Mr. Hamilton infected all it blew upon, with the notable exception, it would seem, of John Knox. Knox took up work within the church as a notary and a tutor. He showed no signs of agreeing with the new heresy that was slowly infiltrating Scotland, until the day the preacher came to town. George Wishart was an unlikely revolutionary. Gentle and serious, while still a student at Cambridge, he regularly gave food and clothing to the poor. It was said that he even donated the sheet from his bed every time he changed it. But Wishart had come to believe that the Roman Catholic Church had lost its way, and he wasn't afraid to make his views known. In 16th century Scotland, it was dangerous to believe in anything that might be described as heretical. But it was downright suicidal to try to persuade other people to believe it with you. So it took enormous courage for George Wishart to agree to an extensive preaching tour of Scotland in 1544.
Wishart is unauthorized, he is not part of the church establishment at all, and he is coming to spread his message, a dangerous message, a heretical message.
Christ only is our Lord and King. We refuse utterly all other means of life and salvation except by Christ only.
Knox was electrified. Here was a young man almost exactly the same age as himself, speaking directly and passionately about a personal relationship with God and risking everything to do so.
Except by Christ only.
Fired with the excitement of his newfound convictions, Knox threw in his lot with Wishart, and sometime around January 1546 went on the road with him.
Knox is a great enthusiast for Wishart, almost like a groupie. So he becomes a semi-bodyguard. The famous image of Knox carrying the big double-handed sword, the original claymore. You get this image of Knox being as proud as anything to be a bodyguard for Wishart.
It was only a matter of time before this unlikely Protestant roadshow came to the attention of the Catholic Archbishop of St Andrews, Cardinal David Beaton.
Cardinal Beaton is a career churchman. He's a statesman. He's also Archbishop of St Andrews, the Primate of Scotland. He's therefore the man at the top.
St Andrews was the ecclesiastical capital of Scotland and a tourist hotspot, then as now. Thousands of people poured into the town every year, not to play golf, but to worship at the shrine of Scotland's patron saint. And this medieval tourist trade helped to make Beaton richer even than the monarch.
He's not himself particularly interested in church reform, and so he sees these heretical threats as just that, a threat to the authority of the church. Heretics cannot defy the church authorities or even the state authorities, and therefore they must be dealt with, and dealt with severely.
Wishart was arrested and incarcerated in the dungeon of St Andrews Castle, but he refused to allow Knox to share in his martyrdom, telling sympathisers to keep Knox away. Wishart was tried and duly sentenced to death. When invited by the church to make a last confession, he gave no sign of recanting. Next day, March the 1st, 1546, Wishart was brought under guard from his cell in the Sea Tower to the forecourt of St Andrew's Castle. His pockets and sleeves were stuffed with gunpowder before he was tied to a stake and set alight. Some said the gunpowder was to create a fireworks display for Cardinal Beaton, who watched the whole thing from the window of his private apartment. The truth is more banal. The executioners, it turned out, weren't very good at burning heretics. They didn't get enough practice, so they stuffed Wishart's pockets with gunpowder in case they botched the job and the poor guy burned too slowly.
Christ only is our Lord and King. We refuse all other means of life and salvation except through Christ only.
As well as enormous courage, it takes a deeply rooted faith to die for an idea. Wishart's martyrdom proved how deeply rooted his Protestant faith had become, too deep for any mere cardinal to uproot. Wishart's martyrdom was to make a huge impact on Knox, but his immediate concern was to evade capture. Knox was forced into hiding, but some more militant Protestants had other ideas. They wanted revenge. Early in the morning of May the 29th, just 3 months after Wishart's execution, a small band of Protestant sympathizers gained entry to St Andrew's Castle. The conspirators surprised the cardinal in his bedchamber, and ignoring his pleas not to kill him because he was a priest, they stabbed him to death. As soon as the word got out, people from the town came running to find out what was happening, and to prove that the cardinal really was dead, they hung his mutilated corpse from the very window from which he'd watched Wishart burn. With Beaton now dead, the conspirators found themselves at the centre of a growing camp of Protestant rebels.
The castle was well defended. A great deal of money had been spent on it in recent times. It occupied this superb promontory. It seemed to be impregnable. And when they stayed there, perhaps they were surprised by the numbers who flocked to it. It's a bit like in a revolution, you capture the palace of the president, and it becomes a symbol of defiance.
The conspirators had struck a blow for Protestantism right at the heart of the Catholic regime. And the government was quick to retaliate. Troops were sent to besiege the castle.
You then get this rather weird siege. One of the odd things for us about 16th century warfare in Scotland is the Scots' habit of both talking and fighting at the same time, which they do quite frequently. And so this sort of constant negotiation going on with people coming in and out of the castle, and yet officially it's under siege.
As time went by, the castle became the focus for religious debate. The first congregation of the Protestant Church was formed within its walls. Gradually, its occupants were joined by other dissidents and malcontents, among them John Knox.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
As the siege continued outside, inside Knox resumed his duties as a tutor. While lecturing on a passage from St John's Gospel, he was overheard by the castle's resident preacher.
And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not.
Deeply impressed by his skills as a communicator, the preacher immediately tried to sign him up as an apologist for the Protestant cause. Knox refused point blank. Why? Well, the reason he gave was that he would not run where God had not called him. He just didn't feel cut out to be a preacher. Or maybe he had no desire to raise his head above the parapet quite so soon after his recent brush with danger.
But the castle preacher is going to have the last word, and he does the dirty on Knox in actually calling him in a sermon. So publicly he points to Knox and says, "You must accept this call." Knox is overcome. He bursts into tears, rushes out and goes to his room. He clearly does